How many of us, looking around the room, how many of us use streaming services to listen to music? Andrew up there for sure. A lot of hands, not 100%, but many of us have dabbled. It's not the only way that I listen, but it's a big one. And I suppose that most of us who have used streaming services have seen the customized, auto-generated playlists that the apps make for you. They're usually weekly. They include a mix of stuff you've deliberately chosen and then recommended new tracks based on your likes and interests. Now, for years, I used to really disdain these attempts at recommendation. I would see what the algorithm had generated for me and scoff in haughty indignation at how little of the spaghetti actually stuck to the wall. A computer? Figure out my taste? It's far too complex and nuanced, I would tell myself. Predictive algorithms can't catch me. And that was true. Until it wasn't. This last year, the playlists started getting really good. The through lines that connected all the disparate genres that I loved started to show up. And I began to see my tastes actually reflected back at me. And it made me kind of sad. I liked feeling inscrutable. Not just because I hate being advertised to, and I really, really do, but because in some way I felt I had been measured. My complex love of music reduced to a type, and an apparently predictable one at that. I know that this sounds overwrought, but there was a level at which I felt a tiny loss of identity, a shrinking of myself. It's not dissimilar to the feeling I had the first time an Instagram clothing ad worked on me. Dang, I thought, they figured me out. Now, today's readings from the book of Acts and the Gospel of Matthew tell two stories about lifting ritualistic requirements that were getting in the way of people connecting with God. It becomes an argument over what God cares about. It's a debate over what it really is that makes us worthy or pure enough to approach God. They ask, what is it that makes me me? Is it what I eat? How I eat? Is it the things I consume? Am I a matter of taste? Does God think that I am a matter of taste? The gospel reading drops us right into the middle of this argument between Jesus and the Pharisees. Just verses before, the Pharisees were criticizing Jesus because they heard that the disciples weren't washing their hands before eating. And this wasn't a hygienic criticism. This was about ritual purity. Insofar as it was religious, this references one of a long and detailed set of laws for priests contained in the later chapters of Exodus. And this particular law dictated the washing of hands and feet before going into what they call the tent of meeting, or where the altar was kept. So, when they accuse Jesus and the disciples, the Pharisees are accusing them of approaching God improperly in an impure or defiled state. Now that word, defile, is harsh. It also means unholy or even like common. It is a powerful word in the vocabulary of religious gatekeepers. And in this context, we can hear defile to mean make unfit to approach God. But you should know also that the Pharisees aren't the ones who use this word. Jesus is the one who introduces it to the conversation. And he kind of throws it in their faces as an accusation. The Pharisees say, in their words, that this is all about breaking tradition. And Jesus basically replies, don't try to downplay it. What you're trying to say is defile. And he says, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles. In other words, What you consume doesn't determine if you're fit or pure or worthy enough to approach God, but what you say might. How? Because what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles. Now, automated music playlists are a pretty low-stakes example here, but it's far from the only instance where the world tries to define us by what we consume. All of that data collected on us, our shopping habits and listening tastes, our TV and movie preferences, it gets packaged up and sold to people who would like to craft very specific messages just for you. Messages to buy certain products or vote for certain people. And folks like Meta and Google make hundreds of billions of dollars off of this every year. I'm recalling that old adage from the dawn of the age of apps. If the product is free, the product is you. So think for a moment about your tastes and preferences, what you choose to take in from the world, and the you that is outlined by these choices. Who does that look like? It can be tempting, in a sense, to define ourselves this way, or to let ourselves be defined in this way. Part of the reason is that consumption is ultimately a passive act. We receive the things we like, we approve or disapprove, we determine whether or not something aligns with our tastes. And our tastes, yes, they're informed by our life experiences, our knowledge of the craft, our cultural language, maybe even real convictions about art or fashion or the ethics of production. But at the end of the day, the choice between like and dislike is not the hardest to make. Whatever our reasons may be, we usually know our answer right away. There's also something to be said about mistaking consuming for expression. It looks different for each of us, but I do believe we all have some level of desire to express ourselves. I might venture to say it is part of our universal humanity, this desire. But expressing yourself through your consumer habits, what you ingest, can be a bit of a cop-out. It scratches the itch, but doesn't answer the call. Now, years ago, a music buddy cautioned me against oversharing your demos, your unfinished work. And this wasn't about developing a bad reputation or anything. He said that the urge to share our art is related to the urge to connect with someone through our art. And that's all fine, but the problem of sharing too early is that sometimes you end up satisfying the urge to connect before the work is even done. And then you can get trapped in that 90% complete, never done space, lacking the motivation to actually finish. Now, this vision of self, the identity created only by our inputs, is a little similar to me. It's lesser, a tempting but ultimately kind of cheap stand-in for what we really want. It costs us less. It asks less of us. And again, I know defile is a harsh word, but when Jesus brings it in, it is to make clear what we are really talking about, how God sees us. Not the cultural value of tradition, not what appeals to our tastes or aesthetics, not the communal language of ritual. Jesus wants to talk about what God sees in us. And he makes it very clear that it's not what goes in, but what comes out that makes the difference. This is the self that God is concerned with. Now, to define ourselves by our outputs, by what comes out of our hearts and what we actually do in the world, is a much more complicated task. For one thing, it's much harder to measure. Reactions are easy, right? Buy or didn't buy, clicked or didn't click, watched for 30 seconds or didn't. But how do you measure how much someone cares? How do you measure passion or love? If you've ever stopped and wondered why the internet is such an angry place, well, part of the reason is that angry reactions are some of the easiest to measure. Much of the social media data collected over the last decade or so just measures engagement. And very early on, everyone figured out that anger is one of the most powerful drivers of engagement online. And if that's the data you have, then that's what you start building around. And eventually you get to the kind of place that we are now. A whole lot of anger and a lot less vision. But think about all that such data misses. Your hopes and your dreams, your actual interests, your choices about how you spend your time and where you put your attention. Not just on your phone, but in the real world. These are the creative choices that flow from your heart. Maybe they're connected to your job. Maybe you get paid for some of this, but maybe not. But either way, these are the things you create. And why should that matter the most to God? Because God's invitation to us is to co-create with them. We took a moment to envision ourselves based only on our tastes earlier. But now, take a moment to imagine what you look like based on your outputs, your creative or creating expression in the world. Who is that person? What do they look like? What is the environment, not that you are reacting to, but what is the environment you are creating? Does this seem like a different person than the one we imagined before? Are they the same? This lesson that comes from Jesus, it's a tough one because he doesn't necessarily suggest a course of action for us. Mainly, he is rebuking a certain idea about what matters to God and calling us into a different way of seeing God and ourselves. But then what? The passage from Acts gives us a little glimpse. We have limited evidence of how the apostles led the early church, but what we do have is precious. This scene comes from the famous Council of Jerusalem around or just before the year 50. And it was called to discuss what welcoming the Gentiles into the movement will really look like. Namely, do they need to be circumcised and adhere to dietary laws? Now, the entire 15th chapter of Acts is well worth a read for anyone looking for scriptural models of how spiritual communities can navigate dissent constructively. I do recommend it if you're at all curious. And the apostles make speeches, they think through their history, and they do their best to faithfully apply the teachings of Jesus to these new situations they find themselves in. After Peter speaks, which we just heard, Paul and Barnabas share stories of their mission work, and then James ultimately decides that these particular rites and rituals are functioning as impediments for some, and for that reason alone should be set aside. In his speech, Peter doesn't quote Jesus' words about what defiles a person, but you can see the lesson showing up. God, who knows the human heart, he says. Jesus said that it was the intentions that come out of our hearts that matter, right? This is where God is looking, not at your hands or your feet or your mouth, but the heart. And Peter says that the Gentiles' hearts have been cleansed by faith, just as their own had been. And this is the most important thing. And knowing so trivializes so many of our other distinctions. So how does faith cleanse a heart? What does faith do to the intentions that come from our hearts. Last week, we spoke about what the abundance of the loaves and fishes miracle allowed that gathered community to do and feel and imagine. And I think that we can speak somewhat similarly here. Faith has many definitions. But today, I ask you to think of it as active trust. It is trust because it is, on a fundamental level, simply believing the promises that God has already made. But all of those promises are covenants, which means we too are obligated, so our trust must be active. And when we actively trust God, I do believe that our hearts and the intentions coming out of them change. When we actively trust God, we're invited to feel safer, more assured. We can take bigger risks. We can love better, bigger, wider than before. We can set aside our coveting, our jealousy, our petty grievances. We need not fear that love is a zero-sum game because we have seen that it is not. We have seen that glory with our own eyes. And we can put a little less pressure on our rites and rituals to render us acceptable before the Lord because that's not why God loves us. We can spend a little less time policing compliance with purity laws and a little more time getting to work, the good work of co-creation, to which God calls all of us. If you didn't have a clear picture of yourself when we imagined our creating selves, take some time this week to look for it, to notice it. Forget about taste for a moment and concentrate on what you're putting out into the world. Drop the playlists and think about the song you want to write, the landscape you want to paint, the poem that waits even now in your fingers. This is the space God is watching. Go and meet her there.